Okay, so I have a $24 million bond that I am putting before you. And so I thought I would explain why I am doing that. I certainly would not be proposing this if I didn't think it was a good idea. I want to see improvement in our schools. I want to see improvement in all of our schools. We keep talking about all 4, but we need to remember we have 17 and we have great need. And first point I wanted to make is that the $64 million bond is not the product of an exhaustive process. We keep hearing that it is, but Buildings for Our Future was never meant to be 4 schools all at once. And what has happened here with the process is that we created an ad hoc committee to look at the bond. We didn't create an ad hoc committee to decide what the best path forward is for the whole district. And when you want to make substantial school improvements and you're asking your taxpayers to make that kind of investment, you need to look at the whole system and make a plan for the whole system to go forward. Now, the ad hoc committee did great work, but they had a very small task. And they actually could not have even looked system-wide. We were requesting the system-wide report, but it did not come out until December, the draft capital plan. The ad hoc committee had settled on their $60 million figure on November 17th. The draft plan came out December 2nd. It was finalized on February 28th, and by that time the bond had already been referred back to the council. So they didn't have an opportunity to look at this bond in the context of the needs of the entire system. And that's what we really need to do if we want to make a plan that is going to allow us to have great schools, all the schools, going forward. So if they'd had a chance to look at the plan, they would have seen that it does not offer great support for this particular bond. These figures are a little hard to see. This is my attempt to take that giant packet, the capital plan, and give you a little representation of what we're looking at. And what did I want you to see on this? I want you to see the big need down in the bottom right corner, $321,726,579 over 20 years. And I also wanted to point out that if you look early on in the short term, you can see that these 4 schools only represent $9 million in the short-term needs, while we've got $30 million in the rest of the district. If you go out 10 years, you can see there's $36 million in need in these schools, but there's 114 in the district. And if we go all the way out, you see that $321 million for the district. And look at that top number. It says the 4 bond schools have $64 million in need. And that sounds great because we're looking at a $64 million bond, right? So you think, oh, they need $64 million of work. We do the $64 million bond. We're done. We can worry about the rest of the chart. The problem is that the $64 million up here is not the $64 million that's in the bond. The bond does not address all the capital needs at these 4 schools. This is from an email that Superintendent Botana sent recently. Estimates that have been prepared in consultation with city staff concluded that between 25 and 37 million in costs would be tackled by the bond. So that's not 64. That's not all the needs at these schools. This bond addresses 25 to 37 million in the costs at these schools. This is what that means. Their capital needs over the next 20 years are 64 million. The capital needs addressed by the bond, 25 to 37. So we pass the bond, we renovate the school. All 4 schools, they still have between $27 and $39 million in capital needs to be addressed. So we haven't taken a big chunk out of the $321 million, and it's not a good plan to go forward. Now, what will happen, most likely, either we will wind up with 27 to 39 million in capital needs still to be addressed after fully renovating 4 schools, which would be quite a shame. More likely, what's going to happen is we'll do school number 1 properly. We'll address its capital needs. We'll do school number 2 properly and address its capital needs, and we won't have money for school number 3 and school number 4. This bond does not add up. Another point I wanted to make is that this bond is not driven by deferred maintenance. We keep hearing the phrase crumbling schools. We keep hearing neglect, and this I understand all the schools have needs, all the schools. All the city buildings have needs. Go up to the planning department, look at the plaster crumbling off the wall here. All of our buildings have some needs. But Oak Point, which did the buildings for our future plan, identified just 5.5 million in deferred maintenance at these 4 schools. And the recently completed assessment, system-wide, identified just 175,000 in immediate needs at the 4 schools, and 8.1 million over the next 5 years. So the schools are not crumbling, they're not falling down. They do need work, but it's not being driven by deferred maintenance, it's not being driven by neglect, and we need to correct that narrative, because it's not true. This is further backed up. Superintendent Botana, in an email to Emily Figdor, one of the leaders of Protect Our Neighborhood Schools, when they were preparing the flyer to go into backpacks to be distributed to promote the bond, he said, I would prefer to eliminate the language about significant investments not being made. That's pretty subjective. At 2 of these schools, the principals have gone out of their way to talk about the many improvements in their physical plant in recent years. Also, we just received a facility assessment for all of our buildings, and the 4 schools have differing levels of needs. What's more, the non-building for our future schools have much larger needs than most of the buildings for our future schools. So again, it's not about deferred maintenance. State funding, here's the other thing that keeps coming up, whether or not we're going to get state funding. And this question was posed by Portland to the state, asking what are our chances for moving up the list in the next cycle. And you can see the answer there is pretty much the answer you would get anytime you ask someone who's about to complete an application process, what are my odds? A large volume of interest has been expressed. And it's not possible to predict any school's rating until the applications have been received and scored. That's standard. That's not saying you don't have a chance. That's saying we have to wait and see. And that's the way a process works. It would be quite irresponsible, actually, of Scott Brown, who is the person who administers this program, to say, oh yeah, you've got it, or no way, no shot. He has to look at all the applications and go through them and make a decision. So you can't tell people in advance. But if we look at the bolded section at the bottom, and particularly the red part at the end, you see that unless there have been significant changes, repeat applications typically fall within similar scoring ranges on the new proposed priority list compared with their placement on the previous priority list. What does that mean? It means if you were getting near the top of the list in the last round, you're going to be near the top of the list in the next round. That's what it means. And I can show you some examples. But first, let's go to Superintendent Botana's remarks at the State Board of Education in December. He said, past history suggests the chances are good for schools in Longfellow and Reike's position to receive state funding in the next round. Oh, I need to go back one. He also said, in other words, it is reasonable to expect these schools, given their past trajectory and the pressing needs as determined by our recent engineering report, will likely be funded in the next round. And finally, no responsible planners could forego the opportunity to advocate for state support, knowing that history suggests a high likelihood that our projects will soon be funded by the state. So it is known that there is a high likelihood. What we don't know is which school will score highest. That is something that has fluctuated, and we can look at our list. This is our school's past performance on the state funding list. In yellow, that means they got funding. And so if you look at this and you look at 2004, 2005, you can see that after Clifford, which did get funding that year, Reike was the next best shot, followed by Longfellow. But then go down to 2010 and you say, oh, Longfellow is the next best shot, followed by Reike. And Lyseth and Przemska did a similar thing. Lyseth was ahead of Przemska in 2004, and then they flipped in 2010. So we don't know which of our schools will place highest on the list. But do not mistake this for thinking they don't move up the list. They do move up the list. This is rankings on the state list by school by year. Clifford from 31st to 1st, and it got funding. Hall, 58th, 55th, 12th, and it got funding. Reiki, 67th, 23rd, 21st. Longfellow, 73rd, 48th, 18th. They're moving up, getting closer. Lyseth slipped back 2 places in 2004 and then moved up. Schools move up the list. That is the way it works. And when the last list closed, Reiki and Longfellow were in the number 1 and number 2 spots for funding. They have an excellent chance for funding, as our superintendent said to the state. The other thing we hear is that there's no way the state would ever fund more than 1 school. They do. In 2004, Blue Hill Regional School District got 2 schools. They got an elementary and a high school. In 2010, Sanford got 3 schools, and Newport got 2. And if Reiki and Longfellow place high on the list again, they could both be funded. Or, since we're applying for some high schools this year, we could get a high school and an elementary. But we need to apply for every school that gives us a shot at state funding. Because remember the need across the system. It is great. It is great. We need to get as much state funding as we can in order to be able to address the needs at these schools.
So, Councilor Ray, you have about 1 minute left of your 10 minutes. Are you going to need an extension? Or?
I will. Just a short one, yeah.
Just a short extension?
Like a five more minutes?
Motion made by Councilor Duson. Is there a second? Seconded by Pius. Is any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor?
Okay, so we know we could get state funding. We've got a really good shot. And the applications are due in April. And knowing that, and knowing how much need there is across the district, and seeing the plan, the capital draft plan, which shows where our greatest need is, I put together an alternate to the $64 million bond. And this is it, and it is also in the backup materials. It completely renovates Lyseth. It does the site work. I said this stuff before. Fire alarms at Lyman Moore and King, 4 classrooms at Ocean Avenue, the Brackett Street entrance, engineering and construction at Reiki, Peaks Island and Riverton energy efficiency upgrades, and Deering High sprinklers and fire alarms. So why Lyseth is probably the first question people would ask when they see this. And there are multiple reasons for that. I also have the tax impact of the bonds, but you can find that in the package. I will just say quickly, the overall cost, if you look at that, is $34 million. That is the principal plus the interest over the course of 24, 25 years, versus $92 million for the $64 million bond. And I just want to point out that this year, the school is looking at a $2 million shortfall, potentially, from the state, and that has caused them to talk about cutting staff, because the school budget is 85% personnel. Now, if we have a $92 million bond that we have to pay off in 27 years, that's approximately $3.5 million a year. So where do we think that $3.5 million is going to come from when the school has to pay $3.5 million every year? They have to find that money in their budgets. They're going to be cutting staff, and it's naive to think otherwise. So here are the rankings, and if you have seen other rankings, there was an error on the initial sheet. It double counted a category. I have the corrected score. I have the one with the error. We can all take a look at that if we want to gather around later. This is the correct ranking. People have suggested that Portland High and, Paths and Casco Bay were ranked first. The consultants, even with the errors, they were not ranked first. What the consultants said is that they would have a better chance if you combined their applications, because the state does like consolidation. It likes when you take 2 schools and put them together. In fact, schools have jumped up the list before by consolidating with a school that's further up the list. That's a state preference. So they would be stronger together, but these are the scores they received. So the reason Lyseth is the one that I decided to put in the bond is because it has the least likelihood of receiving state funding. And that was true on the last list as well. It was the furthest down the list, and it's the furthest down of the rankings now. But that's not the only reason I chose Lyseth. I also chose Lyseth because after talking with city operations staff, I found that the site plans and permitting for Lyseth are already 65% complete. So with that preliminary work already underway, site work could start there as early as spring of 2018. Also, another advantage with Lyseth is when you do construction on a school, you have to shift students. You have to move them around. We don't have extra capacity in the elementary schools right now. We do, however, have Lyman Moore on the same campus as Lyseth, and they have extra capacity. So it is possible that you could create a 5th grade wing at Lyman Moore, shift Lyseth 5th graders to Lyman Moore during the construction. That gives you room in the school to be moving other students around so that construction can be going on. So that's the second reason, and that's the third reason. And then the last reason is that it creates extra capacity in the district and eliminates the modulars at Lyseth. In addition to adding capacity at Lyseth, we need to add more capacity in the system in order to be able to make the other construction projects possible. Right now, there's not a plan for what to do with these kids when their schools are under construction, and there's no place to put them. So Ocean Avenue, which was a state-built school, was built, as is state policy, with the ability to add capacity at a later date when it was needed, and it is needed now. So we need to add those 4 classrooms, and again, engineering, some of the engineering work has been done on these. They could also be started early. Once we have that capacity, then we can look at doing construction on the other schools in the district. But until we have that capacity that would be added between Lyseth Hall and Ocean Avenue, we don't have any place to put those kids, and there's no plan. Now, I included something for Reiki here because city staff said they had really good momentum over there and they wanted to keep going with it, and they also saw that ramp at the Brackett Street entry as something that needed to be taken care of. But before I added it, we contacted the state to make sure it would not affect Reiki's chances for state funding. And the state did confirm that there is a hold harmless clause in the law that assures you that if you want to work on something, a small project, not a full bond of a school, a small project that relates to the health and safety of students, you do not lose points in your application process. As part of this project, the ramp would come down.
Your time is almost moving up. I would ask that we try to get close to the...
We're so close.
Okay.
We're so close.
I understand. She still has a couple minutes. I'm just giving her fair warning where we are.
Couple minutes is plenty. The ramp will come down, and a new entrance and staircase would be installed at Reiki. The second story would be enclosed, further separating the community from the school. And this plan was explained to Scott Brown, who administers the state application process, and he said he did not hear anything that concerned him or would cause a loss of points. Now, last question. If we adopt this $24 million bond proposal, when do we get to the other schools? Not just Reiki, Longfellow, and Presumpscot, Peaks, Cliff, Casco Bay, Paths, Portland High, Deering, Bayside Learning, every other school in the system. This bond makes great strides in tackling immediate needs at 8 schools: Lyseth, Lyman Moore, Ocean Ave, Reiki, Peaks Island, Riverton, and Deering High. In doing that, it relieves some pressure from the city's capital improvement plan going forward and puts us in an excellent position to continue addressing pressing needs through that capital improvement plan. By the summer of 2018, we'll have a good indication of which of our state schools can receive funding. And we will know then what we need to do next, how we can move forward. But to try to move forward before getting that state funding, when we know how vast our need is across this entire system, would be premature. And the word irresponsible has been tossed around a few times. I think it'd be irresponsible. We're talking about a cup of coffee. I'm getting calls from people who are choosing between medication and groceries. They're not going to give up their coffee. They have to give up other things. They have to give up their homes. I am getting a lot of these calls. People are concerned, and 64 million is too much. So once more, the words of the superintendent, no responsible stewards of public funds could finalize plans without knowing whether they needed to stretch available resources over 4 projects or concentrate on 2. And no responsible planners could forego the opportunity to advocate for state support, knowing that history suggests a high likelihood that our projects will soon be funded, and knowing there may not be enough local funds available to fully address the needs of 4 separate schools without state funding. And I would just change that 4 separate schools to 17 separate schools and 3 school facilities and general district needs. Thank you.